The first thing he heard wasn't the thunder cracking over the Dragoon Mountains, but the ragged whisper of a soul giving out. It was a faint, desperate sound, like a dying bird falling from the sky, ending in a soft thud against the planks of his porch. For a man who lived with silence as his only companion, any noise was an intrusion. This one was an omen. He opened his door to find her, a mess of torn silk and dark hair, sprawled on his doorstep, the dust of the Arizona Territory caked on her skin like a second death. And when she finally stirred, his ultimatum was as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. The heat of the Arizona Territory was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down from a bleached white sky and rose up from the cracked, thirsty earth. It was a land that tolerated no weakness, and Jedediah Stone had molded himself in its image. His cabin was nestled in a high, lonely canyon, a fortress of hewn logs and stoic silence, miles from the nearest semblance of civilization in the town of Purgatory Flats. He was a man who had intentionally erased himself from the world, and the world, for the most part, had obliged. That's why the sound was so jarring. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle or the cry of a hawk. It was a soft, final sound, a sigh of utter exhaustion, followed by the gentle thump of a body meeting wood. Jedediah froze, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester, leaning against the wall. He hadn't had a visitor in 3 years. Visitors were trouble. They brought questions, they brought the past, and they brought bullets. He moved to the door not with curiosity, but with the grim caution of a man checking a trap line. He pulled the heavy door inward, just a crack, his eyes narrowing against the glare. There, collapsed on his porch, was a woman, or what was left of one. Her dress, once a fine navy blue silk, was shredded, one sleeve torn completely away. Her dark chestnut hair was matted with dirt and twigs. One of her fine leather shoes was missing, and the exposed foot was swollen and bloodied. She was utterly spent, a broken doll tossed aside by a cruel child. Jedediah watched her for a full minute, his face a mask of stone. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for a decade, was to shut the door. Let the desert claim her. She was not his problem. She was a complication he could not afford. But then a tremor ran through her body, a pathetic involuntary shudder, and a low moan escaped her cracked lips. It was the sound of a creature in its last moments, and something ancient and buried deep inside him stirred. Not pity, but a flicker of recognition. He knew that kind of desperation. He had worn it himself once. With a curse that was more a gust of air than a word, he swung the door open. He bent down his movements, economical and devoid of gentleness, and scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He carried her inside, the unfamiliar scent of lavender and dust filling his small Spartan cabin. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft surface in the one-room dwelling, and stood back looking at her as if she were a venomous snake he'd foolishly brought into his home. He fetched a canteen and a clean rag. He propped her head up and let a few drops of water trickle onto her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of moss, a startling, vibrant green against the pale, grime-streaked canvas of her face. For a moment they were unfocused, wild with fever and fear. Then they locked onto him, and the fear sharpened into intelligent terror. She tried to scramble back, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Man whose porch you decided to die on," he said. His voice was gravel, rough, and unused. "Name's Jedediah." "Please," she begged, the word cracking. Don't send me back." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "Back where? Back to whom?" He saw the faint yellowing bruises on her arm, the raw chafing on her wrist, where a rope or a rough hand had held her. This was not a simple case of getting lost. This was a flight. He spent the next hour in silence, cleaning her wounded foot and binding it with a strip of clean linen. He made a thin broth from jerky and wild herbs and spooned it into her mouth until she turned her head away. He did it all with a detached efficiency, his expression never changing. She watched him, her green eyes tracking his every move, the terror slowly being replaced by a wary confusion. This man was not gentle, but he was not cruel either. He was simply there, an unmovable part of the landscape. By evening the fever had lessened, and she was able to sit up, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. Colour had returned to her cheeks. Strength was returning to her eyes, and with it a defiant spark. "My name is Rosalind," she said, her voice stronger. "Rosalind Finch." Jedediah just nodded, cleaning his hunting knife by the firelight. "I can't thank you enough," she continued, her formal speech sounding alien in the rustic cabin. "If there is any way I can repay you, my father." "Your father can't help you out here," Jedediah cut in, not looking up from his knife. "Whoever you're running from, they're not the type to give up easy. Men who leave marks like the ones on your arms, they see people as property." Rosalind flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. "He won't stop until he finds me." "No," Jedediah agreed, the firelight glinting off the steel blade. "He won't, which brings us to your problem, and mine." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy. "Come morning, you have two choices. The first is you walk away. I'll give you a full canteen of water and a chunk of jerky. You might make it a day. Maybe two. When they find you, and they will, you tell them you never saw me. You tell them you collapsed in the desert and woke up with the food beside you. My existence remains a secret. You go back to whatever hell you ran from." Rosalind stared at him, her heart beginning to pound. The casual brutality of his assessment chilled her to the bone. And the second choice? Jedediah stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The sounds of the desert night, the call of a distant coyote, the chirping of crickets poured in. "The second choice," he said, turning back to face her, his silhouette framed against the deep indigo of the night, "is you stay. You stay here with me. But if you stay, you don't stay as a guest. I can't afford a guest. I can't afford a partner. I can't afford a ward. A woman alone in a man's cabin, it brings questions. It brings trouble. If you stay as my wife." The words hung in the air, more shocking than a gunshot. Rosalind's mouth fell open. Your wife. It's a title. Nothing more," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or romance. "It gives you a name. It gives you a reason to be here. It silences questions before they're asked. It makes you mine to protect, and it makes you beholden to my rules. You cook, you clean. You learn to be silent, and you learn to survive. In return, the man you are running from will have to come through me to get to you. And I assure you," he added, a dangerous glint in his eyes, "most men find that a poor bargain." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "So you have until sunup, Rosalind Finch. Stay as my wife and live under my protection and my law, or leave with nothing and take your chances with the desert and the devil you already know." The sun had not yet breached the jagged peaks of the mountains when Rosalind made her choice. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of Bartholomew Creed, his smug, fleshy features, his small, cruel eyes that seemed to appraise everything from cattle to women with the same cold calculation of ownership. Creed was the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 territories, a man whose land holdings were so vast they were measured in days of hard riding. Her father, a proud man named Walter Finch, had been broken by 2 years of drought and a series of bad investments. Creed had offered a solution: he would absorb her father's debts and restore the Finch name in exchange for Rosalind's hand in marriage. It was a business transaction. Walter Finch had sold his only daughter like a prize heifer to save his own hide and pride. Rosalind had seen what Creed did to things he owned. She'd seen him whip a horse until it collapsed for a minor stumble. She'd heard the whispers about a ranch hand who'd questioned him and was never seen again. The bruises on her arm were from when she'd refused his initial proposal, a gentle reminder from Creed that her consent was a mere formality. That was when she knew she had to run. She'd slipped out in the dead of night with a small satchel and a desperate prayer, running until her body gave out on a stranger's porch. Now she looked at the man who called himself Jedediah. He was a mystery, a hard, unyielding man who offered a life that was little more than a prettier cage. But it was a cage Creed would have to fight to open. The desert was certain death. Creed was a slow, torturous death. Jedediah, he was a chance, a terrifying, unknown, desperate chance. When he rose from his spot by the cold hearth, she was already sitting up on the cot, the wool blanket clutched around her. "I'll stay," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. The fire of defiance was banked, but it was not extinguished. Jedediah nodded, once his expression unchanged. There was no flicker of victory, no satisfaction. It was as if she had just informed him of the weather. "All right," he said. He picked up a worn, leather-bound Bible from a small shelf, its pages yellowed and soft with age. He walked over and stood before her. "There's no preacher here," he stated, opening the book. "And I don't hold with them much anyway. But words have power. A vow is a vow. You make it, you're bound by it. You break it, you answer for it. Understand." Rosalind swallowed her throat dry. She nodded. He didn't ask her to stand. He didn't offer a ring. He simply read from the book, his rough voice, reciting the ancient words of matrimony in a flat monotone. When he got to the part for her vows, he paused and looked at her expectantly. "I, Rosalind Finch." She began, her voice trembling slightly. "Take the Jedediah stone." She recited the words from memory, a bitter mockery of the girlish dreams she'd once had. There was no white dress, no loving crowd, no hopeful groom. There was only a cold cabin, a stranger with haunted eyes, and the absolute certainty that she had just traded one prison for another. When it was done, he closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. "Done," he said. "My name is your name now. You're Rosalind Stone. Forget the other one. It'll keep you safer." And that was it. Her wedding ceremony. The days that followed were a blur of harsh lessons. Life with Jedediah was a stripped-down existence, governed by the sun and the seasons. There was no room for pleasantries or wasted movements. He was a demanding teacher, and survival was the only subject. He started with silence. "Sound travels in these canyons," he told her on the first day, his voice low. A dropped pan, a loud cough, a sharp word. It's like a dinner bell for anyone who might be listening. You learn to move quiet. You learn to live quiet. He taught her how to set snares for rabbits, how to find the bitter roots that were safe to eat, and how to tell the difference between the tracks of a deer and the tracks of a man. He gave her a small skinning knife, and with grim patience showed her how to dress the rabbit she caught. The first time she'd wrenched her stomach, rebelling at the bloody work. Jedediah had simply watched her, his face impassive. "Meat is meat," he'd said. "You want to eat, you learn the cost." He taught her about the rhythm of his life. He would be gone for days at a time, checking his lines, as he put it. He never explained further. Before he left, he would give her a list of chores and a stern warning. Bar the door after me. Don't open it for nothing or no one. Don't light a fire at night unless you're freezing. The smoke can be seen for miles. There's 2 rifles, one over the hearth, one under the cot. You know how to load them. She had shaken her head. Her father believed guns were unladylike. Jedediah's jaw had tightened. He took down the Winchester, its wood stock worn smooth, with use its barrel a dull, deadly grey. He spent the next hour showing her how to load aim and fire, his calloused hands guiding hers. When she finally fired it, the kickback sent a shocking jolt through her shoulder, and the noise was deafening. Again, was all he said. They lived like 2 ghosts, haunting to the same space. They ate their meals in silence. They rarely made eye contact. Rosalind slept on the cot, and he slept on a bedroll on the floor by the door, a position that was both protective and proprietary. He never touched her. His promise that their marriage was just a title held true. Yet there was an intimacy in their shared silence, in the routine of survival they built together. She learned to mend his buckskin shirts, to grind corn into coarse flour, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. She saw the man beneath the harsh exterior in small, fleeting glimpses. She saw the way his hands, though rough, could be surprisingly gentle when resetting a rabbit's broken leg in a snare before letting it go. She noticed a series of faded notches carved into the cabin's mantelpiece, and once late at night, she saw him trace them with his finger, a look of such profound loss on his face that it made her ache. But she never asked. Questions were not part of their bargain. One evening, about a month into her new life, he came back from one of his trips later than usual. He was limping, and there was a dark, ugly gash on his forearm. What happened? The question slipped out before she could stop it. It was the first personal question she had ever asked him. He shot her a look, sharp and cold. Doesn't concern you. He began to crudely stitch the wound himself with a needle and thread his movements clumsy from the awkward angle. Rosalind watched him for a moment, her heart beating a little faster. This was a line. She could retreat back into silence, or she could cross it. Taking a deep breath, she took the needle and thread from his hand. "Sit down," she said, her voice firm. "I'll do it." He stared at her, his eyes searching her face. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod and sat extending his arm. Her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the wound and began to stitch the flesh together, her stitches far neater and surer than his. They sat in silence, the only sound the hiss of the fire and the whisper of the thread passing through skin. In that moment, something shifted. The lines of their bargain, once so clear and stark, began to blur. She was no longer just a refugee, and he was no longer just her keeper. They were 2 people bound by a vow, tending to a wound in a silent cabin, with the whole dangerous world waiting outside. The wound on Jedediah's arm healed into a jagged silver scar, another mark on a body that was a roadmap of violent encounters. He never spoke of how he got it, and Rosalind never asked again. But the incident had subtly altered the terrain of their relationship. A fragile trust, as delicate as a spider's web, had begun to form in the spaces between their silences. He started leaving her with more responsibilities, and he began to talk to her, not in conversation, but in instruction. "That cloud formation," he'd grunt, pointing to the west. "Means rain in 2 days. Hard rain. We need to check the roof." "See that bent twig on the trail?" He'd say, stopping on a rare walk together. "Something heavy came through here. Too heavy for a deer. a bear or a man with a pack. We go a different way. She was a quick study. The city-bred woman who had once fainted at the sight of a mouse was now a creature of the mountains. Her hands became calloused, her skin tanned by the sun. She could read the land move without a sound and handle a rifle with practiced competence. The fear that had been her constant companion was replaced by a quiet vigilance. She had not found happiness, but she had found a fierce, unyielding will to survive. One morning, Jedediah announced, "We're low on salt and flour, and I need primers for the cartridges. We're going to town." Rosalind's blood ran cold. Town meant people. It meant exposure. Town. Purgatory Flats, he confirmed. It's a half-forgotten speck on the map, mostly prospectors and trappers. Not the kind of place your Mr. Creed would look for you. But you'll need a disguise. He produced a beat-up leather hat with a wide brim and a dusty, oversized man's jacket. Keep your head down, your hair up under the hat, and don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to. You're my wife. You're shy. You let me do the talking. The journey to Purgatory Flats took the better part of a day on horseback. The town was exactly as Jedediah had described it, a single dusty street lined with a handful of weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and not much else. It was a place for people who didn't want to be found. Jedediah dismounted in front of the general store, his movements fluid and confident. He seemed different here, more dangerous. In the isolation of the cabin, he was a survivalist. Here, surrounded by other men, he was an outlaw. The way he walked, the way his eyes constantly scanned the street, the way his hand never strayed far from the Colt peacemaker on his hip, it all spoke of a man who expected trouble. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee leather and chewing tobacco. An old man with a long tobacco-stained beard stood behind the counter. His name was Silas Kane. "Jedediah." The old man grunted, his eyes flicking from Jedediah to Rosalind and back again. "Been a while. Figured a rattler had gotten you." "Not yet, Silas." Jedediah replied, his voice low. "Need supplies." He handed over a list. As Silas gathered the items, his curious gaze kept landing on Rosalind, who was doing her best to study a barrel of pickles. "Got yourself some company?" Silas observed his voice, casual but his eyes sharp. "My wife," Jedediah said, the words sounding slightly less forced than they had in the cabin. Silas raised a bushy eyebrow. "Well, I'll be. Never thought I'd see the day. Congratulations to you, Mom." Rosalind just nodded, keeping her face hidden by the brim of the hat. As they were about to leave, a man stumbled in from the saloon. Next door, his face flushed with cheap whiskey. He was large and loud, with a deputy's badge pinned crookedly to his vest. "Stone," he slurred, pointing a thick finger at Jedediah. "I know you. You're that wanted man from up in the Red River country. The one who—" Before he could finish, Jedediah moved. He was not fast. He was instant. One moment he was by the counter, the next he was in front of the deputy. His left hand clamped over the man's mouth, his right forearm pressed hard against his throat. The deputy's eyes bulged, his drunken bravado vanishing in a heartbeat. "You're mistaken," Jedediah said, his voice a lethal whisper. "I've never been to Red River, and you've never seen me before. Have you?" He applied a little more pressure. The deputy made a gurgling sound and shook his head frantically. Jedediah released him. The man staggered back, gasping for air, a new fear in his whiskey-soaked eyes. He looked at Jedediah, then at Rosalind, and then scrambled out of the store without another word. The silence in the store was heavy. Silas Kane just shook his head, slowly polishing a glass with a rag. "You bring trouble with you like a shadow, Jedediah. Always have." "He was drunk," Jedediah said, gathering their supplies. "He was drunk, but he wasn't wrong," Silas countered quietly. "Some stories drift a long way. The story of the rancher who lost everything, it drifts." Jedediah went rigid. He threw a few coins on the counter. "This covers it. We're leaving." He grabbed Rosalind's arm and steered her out of the store. His grip was like iron. As they mounted their horses, Rosalind's eyes scanned the street. Her gaze fell on the wall of the blacksmith's shop. It was covered in notices and posters, and one of them, freshly nailed, made her soul turn to ice. It was a crude sketch, but the likeness was undeniable. The moss-green eyes, the shape of the face. Underneath it were the words, "Wanted 500 reward for information leading to the return of Rosalind Finch property of Bartholomew Creed. Inquire at the Creed Ranch." Her breath caught in her throat. Property. The word was a brand. Jedediah followed her gaze. He saw the poster, and his face became a thundercloud. He didn't say a word. He just nudged his horse forward, pulling her horse along with him, and they rode out of Purgatory Flats, the dust swallowing them up. The ride back to the cabin was suffocatingly silent. The trust they had started to build had been shattered by the ghosts of their pasts. He was a wanted man, a former rancher who had lost everything. She was a piece of property with a price on her head. They were not just two people surviving. They were two fugitives hiding in a borrowed time. That night, for the first time, he didn't sleep on the floor. He sat in a chair by the door, the Winchester across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. The world had found them, and now it was coming. The discovery of the wanted poster changed the air in the cabin. The quiet had once been a shared space of survival. Now it was thick with unspoken questions and simmering tension. Rosalind found herself studying Jedediah, truly looking at him for the first time, not just as a protector or a captor, but as a man with a history as broken as her own. The comment from Silas Kane, the story of the rancher who lost everything, replayed in her mind. A few days after their trip to town, a storm rolled in from the west, a furious black-bellied squall that turned the sky to night and lashed the canyon with sheets of rain. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the thunder was a constant bone-jarring percussion. They were trapped, sealed inside the cabin as the world raged outside. Jedediah worked methodically, checking the seals on the windows, reinforcing the bar on the door. Rosalind kept the fire stoked, the small flame, a defiant orange glow against the gloom. The storm seemed to magnify the suffocating silence between them. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke. "Red River," she said softly. Jedediah, who was sharpening his knife by the hearth, didn't stop. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only reply. "The deputy in town," she pressed on her voice, gaining a bit of strength. "And Silas, they mentioned it. They said you were a rancher." The scraping stopped. He set the knife and stone down with deliberate care. He looked into the fire, his profile etched by the dancing light, his face a landscape of hard lines and old sorrows. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice low and raspy. "A different life, a different man." Rosalind waited. The howling of the wind filled the silence, and for a moment she thought that was all the answer she would get. But then he began to speak the words, coming out slowly, painfully, like stones being pulled from a deep, cold well. "The name wasn't always just Jedediah," he began. "It was Jedediah Stone. I had a wife, Mary, and a son, Daniel. He was 6 years old." He paused and swallowed hard. "We had a small ranch in the Red River Valley. Good water, good grazing land. It wasn't much, but it was ours. We were happy. The word happy sounded foreign and strange coming from his lips. There was another man there, a man named Titus Black. He was like your creed, big, ambitious. He wanted to own the whole valley. My ranch had the only year-round spring for 10 miles. He tried to buy me out. I said no. My family was buried on that land. You don't sell your bones. So he found another way. Jedediah continued, his voice hardening. He started small. A few of my cattle would go missing. Then a dozen. I couldn't prove it was him. Then one day the marshal, a man on Black's payroll, showed up with a warrant. They accused me of rustling my own cattle for insurance fraud. It was a lie from start to finish, but Black owned the judge, he owned the law. He picked up a piece of kindling and stared at it, his knuckles white. They were going to take the ranch, take everything. I told Mary to take Daniel and ride for her brother's place in the next county, to stay there until I could clear my name. I was going to fight it. A log in the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Black and his men, they didn't want to wait for the courts. They came for the ranch that night. I was waiting for them. There was a fight. Gunfire. His gaze became distant, lost in a memory she couldn't see. The lamp in the barn was knocked over. The hay, it went up like tinder. Mary and Daniel, they hadn't left. She was afraid to travel in the dark. They were hiding in the hayloft. The breath hitched in Rosalind's chest. Her hand flew to her mouth. Jedediah's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, raw with a grief that time had clearly not healed. I heard them screaming, but I couldn't get to them. The whole barn was an inferno. I lost everything. My home, my name, my wife, my son. He fell silent. The story hung in the air, a horror that filled every corner of the small cabin. His isolation, his harshness, his silence, it all snapped into focus. He wasn't just a man who chose to be alone. He was a man who had had everything torn away from him. They put out a warrant for my arrest. He finished, his voice flat and dead again. For the murder of the 2 men I killed defending my home. For arson. For the murder of my own family. Titus Black owned the story. He made me a monster. So I became a ghost. I came here. Left Jedediah Stone to die in that fire and became just Jedediah. He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with an unshed agony that pierced her to the core. Men like Black, like your creed, they don't just take what you have. They take who you are. They burn your world down and salt the earth so nothing can ever grow again. Without thinking, Rosalind moved from her stool and knelt on the hearth beside him. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words were meaningless in the face of such a colossal loss. Instead, she gently took the piece of kindling from his clenched fist, her fingers brushing against his. It was the first time she had ever initiated contact. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "You're wrong," she said, her voice a fierce, low whisper. Something did grow again. He looked at her confused. "You survived," she stated simply. "You built this. You learned to live in the ashes. That isn't nothing." They stayed like that for a long time, as the storm raged outside, 2 broken people finding a strange, fragile solace in the ruins of their pasts. The wall of stone around Jedediah's heart had finally cracked, and through that crack, Rosalind saw the man he had been. And for the first time, looking at this scarred, grieving outlaw, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like she was home. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the world outside glistening and new. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a similar cleansing. Jedediah's confession had acted like a lightning strike, shattering the pretense of their arrangement, and illuminating the truth of their shared condition. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a desperate contract. They were Jedediah and Rosalind allies, forged in a crucible of loss and survival. The change was subtle, but profound. He started calling her Rosalind instead of just you. He would occasionally share a story about his son Daniel, a small, bittersweet memory, like a preserved flower pressed between the pages of a book. She in turn found herself smiling a real smile that reached her eyes when he managed to trap a particularly fat grouse for their dinner. The cabin began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. But the wanted poster in Purgatory Flats was a promise of violence to come, and they both knew it. Bartholomew Creed was not a man to let his property go. The reckoning came 2 weeks later. It was just before dawn in that grey ethereal light when the world is still holding its breath. Jedediah was already awake, as always sitting in his chair by the door. It was a slight sound that alerted him, the unnatural clink of a horseshoe against rock, a sound that didn't belong to the deer or coyotes that roamed the canyon. He was on his feet in an instant, his movements silent and fluid. "Get up," he whispered to Rosalind, his voice taut with urgency. "Get the rifle from under the cot, stay away from the window." Rosalind's heart leaped into her throat, but panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. The training Jedediah had given her took over. She retrieved the Winchester, checked the load, and moved to the rear of the cabin, her back against the solid log wall, just as he had taught her. Jedediah peered through a tiny, cleverly hidden peephole he'd drilled in the door. His body went rigid. "It's him," he hissed. "Creed, and he's got at least 5 men with him. One of them is wearing a badge." Rosalind felt a wave of icy dread. Deputy Miller, the drunken man from the store, must have sobered up and sold his information. A voice, thick with arrogance and authority, boomed through the morning air. "Jedediah Stone, we know you're in there, and we know you have my fiancée, Rosalind Finch. I am Bartholomew Creed. You have one chance to send her out unharmed. After that, I will burn this cabin to the ground with you in it." Jedediah's face was grim. "He learned my name." He muttered more to himself than to her. "He's been digging." He glanced back at Rosalind. "Stay down. No matter what you hear, you stay down." "Jedediah! No!" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't." He gave her a look she'd never seen before, a flash of raw, protective fire. "This is my fight now, too," he said, and then he turned back to the door. "She's not your fiancée, Creed," Jedediah shouted back, his voice echoing in the quiet canyon. "She's my wife, and this is my land. Turn around and ride away, and you'll live to see sunset." There was a moment of silence, and then a sneering laugh from outside. "Your wife. You think a squatter's vow means anything? She is mine." The first gunshot was the signal. It splintered the wood of the doorframe inches from Jedediah's head. The siege had begun. What followed was a terrifying symphony of violence. Gunfire erupted from all sides as Creed's men spread out in the rocks, opened fire on the cabin. Wood-splintered glass shattered from the single window, and bullets thudded into the thick log walls. Jedediah was a force of nature. He moved from the door to the window, never offering a stationary target, firing his own rifle with deadly economical precision. Each shot was aimed controlled. A cry of pain from outside told him one had found its mark. Rosalind, huddled against the back wall, forced herself to breathe. She was terrified, but she was not the same woman who had collapsed on the porch. She crawled to the ammunition box, her hand steady, and began reloading the spare rifle. When Jedediah fell back from the window to reload, she was there pressing the fresh rifle into his hands. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that glance, an entire conversation passed between them. An acknowledgement. A partnership. The back wall. Jedediah grunted, pointing to a small shuttered opening near the floor used for ventilation. "They'll think we're pinned at the front. Watch that side." Nodding, Rosalind crawled to the opening, her heart pounding against her ribs. She carefully nudged the shutter open a crack. She could see one of Creed's men, a lanky man with a cruel face, trying to sneak around the side of the cabin, a torch in his hand. He was planning to set the cabin ablaze, just as Titus Black had done. A cold rage, clear and pure, washed over her. She thought of Jedediah's story of Mary and Daniel, of the smell of smoke and the sound of screams. Not again. She rested the barrel of the rifle on the opening, took a deep breath, just as Jedediah had taught her, lined up the sight on the man's leg, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man screamed and dropped the torch, clutching his thigh as he collapsed. The torch sputtered out in the damp morning grass. From the front of the cabin, Jedediah let out a low whistle of approval. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The sun rose higher, baking the canyon. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. They were outnumbered, and their ammunition was running low. A bullet grazed Jedediah's shoulder, and he grunted in pain but kept firing. Then there was a lull. "Give it up, Stone!" Creed's voice roared, laced with frustration. "I have all day. You're bleeding. You can't have much fight left in you." Jedediah leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. He looked at Rosalind, his eyes filled with a grim apology. He was preparing to make a final desperate stand. But Rosalind had another idea. The fear was still there, but beneath it a new and unfamiliar strength was taking root. She was no longer just a piece of property to be fought over. She was Rosalind Stone, and this was her home. "Don't," she said, putting a hand on his good arm. "Let me." Before he could protest, she stood up and walked to the shattered doorway, unarmed, her hands held up in surrender. "Stop shooting," she cried, her voice clear and strong. "I'll come out." Jedediah's blood ran cold. "Rosalind, no," he snarled, trying to get to his feet to pull her back. She glanced over her shoulder, and the look in her eyes stopped him. It was not the look of a victim surrendering. It was the look of a queen moving her most valuable piece into play. It was a calculated risk filled with a courage that stunned him. "Trust me," she mouthed. Bartholomew Creed let out a triumphant laugh from behind a large boulder. "Finally the little bird comes to her senses. Come on out, my dear. Slowly. Leave the outlaw to die in his hole." Rosalind took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch, her chin held high. She stood in the morning sun, her tattered dress and disheveled hair a stark contrast to her regal bearing. She ignored the guns trained on her and fixed her gaze directly on the boulder where Creed was hiding. "Show yourself, Bartholomew," she called out, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Or are you going to hide behind your hired guns like the coward you are?" There was a moment of stunned silence from Creed's men. They were hired to retrieve a frightened girl, not to face down a defiant woman who seemed utterly unafraid of them. Goaded Creed finally stepped out into the open. He was a large man, dressed in expensive clothes that were now covered in dust. His face was florid with anger and exertion. He held a pistol, but he looked less like a hardened gunman and more like a petulant tyrant. "Rosalind, you have caused me a great deal of trouble," he boomed, striding forward, "but I am a forgiving man. Come here. We will forget this unfortunate business." "No," she said, her voice as sharp and clear as glass. "There is nothing to forget because I am not going anywhere with you." Creed's face purpled with rage. You are my property. My father made a desperate deal. Rosalind cut him off, but you seem to have forgotten one crucial detail. Bartholomew, I am not a parcel of land or a head of cattle. I am a person, and my answer is no. From behind another rock, Deputy Miller watched the exchange, a look of growing unease on his face. This was not what he had signed up for. He'd thought he was helping a powerful man retrieve his runaway bride-to-be, not participating in a small war against a woman who was clearly being held against her will no longer. You think this half-dead outlaw can protect you? Creed sneered, gesturing contemptuously at the cabin. I will have you, and I will have his head on a spike. He is my husband, Rosalind said, and the words which had once been a lie of convenience now rang with the unmistakable conviction of truth. And he is 10 times the man you will ever be. He offered me a choice. All you have ever offered me is a cage. As she spoke, Jedediah appeared in the doorway behind her. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, his shoulder bleeding freely, but he held his Winchester in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. He was there as a witness, as her support, not her champion. This was her fight. This is over, Creed, Rosalind said, her voice dropping to a steely calm. Look at your men. One is wounded, because of you. Deputy, she said, turning her head slightly to address Miller. Is this what the law in this territory has become, an instrument for a rich man's temper tantrum? Is this the oath you swore? Miller shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking from Rosalind's defiant face to Creed's contorted one, and then to his own badge. He had seen the poster. He knew Creed had advertised her as property. He had heard the stories about Creed's ruthlessness. He was just a drunk who took a bribe, but even he had a line. She's right, Mr. Creed. Miller said, his voice surprisingly firm. This has gone far enough. This is not official business. We're withdrawing. Creed whirled on him, his face a mask of disbelief. You work for me, you sniveling drunk? Not anymore, Miller said. And to the shock of everyone, he unpinned the badge from his vest and tossed it into the dust. I might be a drunk, but I'm not your dog. He turned to the other men. Let's go. The job's done. The other hired guns looked at each other, then at their wounded companion, and then at Creed. They were paid to be tough, not to die in a pointless siege for a man's pride. One by one they lowered their rifles and began to back away, helping their injured comrade. Bartholomew Creed was left standing alone, his authority, his power, his entire world crumbling around him in a dusty canyon. He stared at Rosalind, his eyes filled with a venomous, impotent rage. All his money, all his influence had been defeated by a runaway girl and a broken-down outlaw. This isn't over. He snarled, his voice a pathetic rasp. He raised his pistol, his hand trembling with fury, and aimed it squarely at Rosalind. He never fired the shot. A gunshot cracked through the air, but it wasn't from Creed's pistol. It was from Jedediah's Winchester. The bullet didn't hit Creed. It hit the pistol in his hand, sending it spinning into the dirt with a sharp clang. Creed cried out, clutching his stinging, numb fingers. Jedediah now stood tall, the pain from his wound forgotten, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that promised death. It is over, he said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of absolute certainty. You will get on your horse. You will ride out of this canyon. And if you or any man who works for you ever sets foot in these mountains again, I will not aim for the gun. I will bury you where you stand. The threat was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. Bartholomew Creed stared at the man he had dismissed as a squatter, and for the first time in his life he knew true fear. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, He turned without another word, scrambled onto his horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and his shattered pride behind him. Rosalind watched him go, then slowly turned to face Jedediah. The tension of the last hour finally broke, and her legs gave way. He lunged forward, catching her with his good arm before she could fall. They held on to each other, two survivors amid the wreckage of their home, the rising sun warming their faces. The siege was over. They had won. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, the canyon seemed to exhale. The acrid smell of gunpowder slowly dissipated on the morning breeze, replaced by the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin was a wreck. The door hung off one hinge, the window was a gaping hole, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. But it was still standing. It was their home. Rosalind insisted on tending to Jedediah's shoulder first. Her hands were gentle and sure as she cleaned the wound and bound it tightly with fresh linen. The pain was considerable, but he bore it with his usual stoicism, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw not the frightened girl who had collapsed on his porch, but a woman of formidable strength and unshakable will. "You shot the torch out of his hand," he said, his voice raspy with a mixture of pain and awe. "You taught me how to shoot," she replied, simply, her focus entirely on her task. "I taught you how to aim," he corrected her softly. "Courage is something you're born with." When she was finished, they worked together in a comfortable silence, cleaning up the mess. They patched the window with a spare piece of hide, reinforced the door, and swept up the splinters of wood and shattered glass. Each shared task was a quiet affirmation of what they had just fought for. This was not his cabin anymore. It was theirs. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the canyon, they sat together on the porch step, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple. "He'll be back," Jedediah said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. A man like Creed did not forgive humiliation. "I know," Rosalind said. She wasn't afraid. "He won't come here. He's a coward, but he'll use his money. He'll send more men. Lawmen with real badges this time. He'll make your wanted poster appear in every town from here to the border." Jedediah nodded grimly. "My life as a ghost is over. They'll hunt me now." He looked down at his calloused hands. "You're not safe with me anymore, Rosalind. Creed knows your name is Stone. He knows you chose this. Staying with me, it puts a target on your back." He turned to look at her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Our bargain is finished. You faced him down. You're free of him. I can give you a horse, provisions, and all the money I have. You can go anywhere. Start a new life. A real one. No one would blame you for leaving." It was the most selfless thing he had ever said. He was offering her an escape, an out from the dangerous life that now certainly awaited him. Rosalind listened to his words, and then she looked out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous landscape that had become her home. She thought of her old life, a life of silk dresses and suffocating expectations. And she thought of this new life, a life of hardship, silence, and survival, a life where she had discovered who she truly was. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, but his hand was warm and strong. "Jedediah," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "When I came here, I was running away from something. I'm not running anymore." She turned her gaze from the mountains to meet his. "You told me I had two choices that first day. Stay as your wife or leave with nothing. But you were wrong." He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "There's a third choice," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. I stay as your wife, not as a title, not as a bargain, but for real." Understanding dawned in Jedediah's eyes, followed by a wave of emotion, so powerful it seemed to shake his very foundation. The walls he had spent a decade building around his heart finally completely crumbled to dust. The outlaw, the ghost, the broken rancher, they all receded, leaving only Jedediah Stone, a man who had been given a second chance at a life he thought was lost forever. He didn't need to speak. He simply brought her hand to his lips and held it there, a vow more powerful than any words spoken over a Bible. They were not a rancher and his bride, nor an outlaw and his ward. They were two survivors, two souls who had been burned down to their foundations and had found in the ashes a way to build something new together. Their life would not be easy. They would be hunted. They would have to fight. But for the first time, they would not be fighting alone. On a bullet-scarred porch in a lonely canyon under a sky full of stars, the runaway girl and the lone outlaw had finally found their home. And so, a story that began with a desperate bargain on a lonely porch became a testament to the unyielding power of the human spirit. It wasn't a fairy tale romance written in the stars, but a love story forged in gunpowder and grit, silence, and survival. Rosalind and Jedediah, two people the world had tried to break, found in each other not an escape, but a reason to stand their ground. They teach us that sometimes home isn't a place you find, but a fortress you build with the one person willing to fight alongside you. Their future was uncertain, a dangerous path winding through the Wild West. But they would walk it together. If this story of survival courage and a love forged in the heart of the unforgiving frontier resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates tales of the Old West, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.